Public Bodies etc. Scotland Act 2003, which is the treatment of non-executive directors of the Scottish National Investment Bank plc as specified authorities, Order 2020. So can I welcome Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, and Christopher Nicholson, the Scottish National Investment Bank Head of Governance and Policy. As I said, broadcasting today will be operating via the microphones because they're working remotely today. So if you can wait for me to introduce you between each person speaking, and then wait for your microphone to light up before you speak. So can I start by inviting Fiona Hislop to make her opening statement on the instrument?
Good morning, Convener and committee members. The purpose of the order is to enable the Commissioner for Ethical Standards in Public Life in Scotland to regulate appointment of non-executive directors to the board of the Scottish National Investment Bank. This will take place prior to the new body coming into effect in the second half of 2020. This follows the appointment of the Chair Designate in November 2019 and the Scottish National Investment Bank Bill receiving royal assent last month. Putting the order in place is a vital step towards ensuring that the board of the Scottish National Investment Bank have the right skills and expertise and that they are in place for day one of the bank being established. Appointing the right people with the right skills is crucial for any organisation, and it is particularly the case for the Scottish National Investment Bank. The bank will be a cornerstone financial institution for Scotland, whose success will depend on the skills and credibility of its leadership. We also want to ensure that there will be a diverse and strong field of suitable candidates. Equality is, of course, an integral part of the Scottish Government's business, as the Gender Representation on Public Boards Scotland Act 2018 is now in force. We will be working towards equal gender representation on the Consumer Scottish National Investment Bank Board. We also want to ensure that the appointments are made on merit following an open, fair and impartial process that will be publicly advertised. The full participation of the Commissioner's Office will help to ensure that. The Commissioner's Office has been fully engaged to date. It will assist with interviews and will be involved in a widely publicised advertising campaign that is designed to attract a strong and diverse field of candidates. The draft order will allow the appointment process to be progressed with immediate effect, and we hope will enable the Board of Consumer Scotland to be in place by July 2020. I hope that the order will receive the committee's support, and my official and I are happy to take questions.
Very much, Cabinet Secretary. So I'm going to move to questions from the members. Can I start with Andy Whiteman, please?
Yes, thank you, Convener. You mentioned Consumer Scotland. This is not an order about the Scottish National Investment Bank?
It's the Scottish National Investment Bank.
Okay, yeah. So there was some concern about the fact that the chair of the Scottish National Investment Bank was appointed without oversight by the Ethical Standards Commissioner, and this committee wrote to the government asking that that be done. As I understand it from evidence that Caroline Anderson, who was the Ethical Standards Commissioner, gave at the Scottish Public Appointments Committee in February this year, she was saying that she would be happy to do that, but there was no Section 3.3 order. The order we're dealing with today laid, and therefore it was ultra vires for her to do that. Why wasn't a 3.3 order laid before the chair was appointed, so as to ensure that that appointment would come under the scrutiny of the Ethical Standards Commissioner?
Well, clearly in terms of establishing the Scottish National Investment Bank, there is a process which this committee has been involved in. Technically, however, legal convention dictates that a 3.3 order for a new body would not be laid in Parliament before the bill to create the new body has parliamentary approval, and to do that would preempt the will of Parliament and undermine the process. So I'm not sure if Mr Whiteman was a member of the committee throughout this period, but that certainly there's been something that the previous Cabinet Secretary had engaged with the committee on, and indeed in response to a request by Derek Mackay to be involved, if she could be involved, she said, and that I think was at the request of this committee, I quote her letter of the 13th of June 2019, where she said, I understand why the committee may wish to see some form of oversight for this appointment process, but regret that it's not something that I would be able to do. So she was quite clear about that, and that was something that was accepted by the committee at the time.
It was, yes. She could have done that had there been a 3-3 order, but your position is that there wasn't an order because convention dictates that you don't lay an order before the bill has royal assent.
Well, the organisation didn't exist, so in terms of the process, in terms of the order, particularly a request for the commissioner has themselves, a list of what they can do and not do, in terms of their operation, and so therefore, in terms of the referral, it's important to have the body in place first. So it's a chicken and egg. You obviously want to make sure that you've got the body in place, and then you then have the process, which we're now doing today for the other executive members. But we felt it was very important to make sure that to hit the ground running, that this bank was properly in place, and that it was important to have a chair designate in place. And that was something that was fully, and frankly, I've obviously coming into post, looked at the processes of this. I've dealt with a number of appointments over many years for many different organisations, and I think the very positive engagement that the previous Cabinet Secretary had with this committee on this process is very clear. But if I can maybe bring in Chris Nicholson to address your particular point as well.
Have a chance to know who's speaking.
Okay, so we'll slow down, and I'm
not in terms of your speaking, but when we move from person to person.
With your agreement, I'll ask Christopher Nicholson, my official, to address some of the points that Andy Whiteman has made.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. Christopher Nicholson.
Yes, thank you. Is this on?
Mm-hmm. Yes, you're on.
Super, thank you. Sorry, it's difficult. Yeah, just as the Cabinet Secretary mentioned for the member, the approach which I think is outlined in the first letter to the committee from 24th of April last year was that because it was a new body and following the guidance for the setup of new bodies, we wanted to have the chair designate in place to make a meaningful contribution to the development of the programme to establish the bank. And that meant proceeding with an unregulated process prior to the bill receiving stage 1 support, so we could go out to advertise immediately, and that's the reason why a section 3 order was not sought at the time.
But just to be clear, I don't want to be pedantic on this, but I'm just trying to get clear for the record. A section 3 order could have been sought immediately after stage 1.
That is correct, consent. Yes. But if you'd sought an order, and it's an affirmative order after stage 1, you'd then be in the process of having to wait for that order to pass Parliament before you could even go out to advertise. That would have delayed the recruitment of the incoming chair significantly to the timetable we're operating to. And for the reasons outlined in the correspondence with committee, we thought, and the committee agreed, that it was appropriate to proceed on that accelerated timetable. So, I mean, there were 2 objectives in doing so: to get the right person, which we've done, and to get that person in early so they can start to be involved in those key decisions for the development of the bank, which they have been.
Okay, thanks, Convener.
Willie Coffey. Wait a minute.
Thank you very much, Convener. Just despite that unregulated aspect of this process, the process that was followed the code of practice. Are we happy and content with that?
Yes. The answer to that is yes.
Yeah, okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Are the members satisfied with the evidence they've heard? Yep. Okay. In that case, I'll move us to item 4. Can I put the question? And the question is that motion... Oh, sorry. Yes, it would help if you moved the motion first. Cabinet Secretary, can I get you to move the motion, please?
Formally moved.
Thank you. In that case, I can now put the question, and that is that motion S5M-21312 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? That is agreed. Okay. Now, in the light of the timing, can I just invite the committee to agree that myself as convener and the clerk can produce a short factual report of the committee's decision and arrange to have it published? Everybody agreed? Thank you. Right. Thank you, Cabinet Secretary, and thank you very much, Mr. Nicholson, for attending. Right, now we will move to item 5. And item 5 is to take evidence on COVID-19 and its impact on the economy and work. So we'll just change our witnesses. So our witnesses for this item include Fiona Hislop, Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Fair Work and Culture, and Gary Gillespie, who is our Chief Economist, and Ian Story, just hiding behind the bits there, who is Head of Non-Domestic Rates Policy. So, as before, if I can remind you to wait until you're introduced and for your microphone to come on before you speak, that will ensure that broadcasting are able to pick you up. Right, can I invite the Cabinet Secretary, please, to make an opening statement? Fiona Hislop.
Thank you, Convener, for the opportunity to update the committee on the economic response to COVID-19. I will outline what we are doing to protect lives and support the economy during what is both a health and economic emergency. But first, the underlying principles. My ask of business, individuals and society is for everyone to take responsibility and to do the right thing to help us get through this. We need everyone to be part of that national mission to beat the virus. I want to say thank you to the vast majority of companies who are doing the right thing for their families and the country. And I've got a clear message. A critical business need is not what is critical to run your business. It is what is critical to run the country. The Prime Minister and the First Minister, in their statements last night, made it quite clear that we are now in a new era of new strict restrictions. Employers must protect their workers and embed the ethos of fair work. Employers must allow their staff to follow medical advice, to isolate either themselves or as part of their households, and they should allow and ensure workers work from home and stay home. Workers should never feel pressured to breach advice, and workers should not be put at unnecessary risk, nor should they put others at risk of infection. So in terms of what I request is people should be working from home and stay home. For any workers who are not part of the essential work for critical provision to help keep the country running or indeed for health purposes. The public must stay at home to contain the spread of coronavirus and save lives. People must not travel for tourist activity, particularly to the Highlands and Islands. People must stop panic buying food supplies, and we must ensure that the livelihoods of all parts of the country, whether it be rural, island, or indeed the central belt, cities, towns and villages, are protected. There are sufficient stocks to provide enough food and other essentials for everyone. The economic impacts will be significant. Despite all the measures taken to date, businesses are closing and workers are losing jobs. But we must get as many businesses as possible to operate remotely, with staff working from home or to go into hibernation and use the wage subsidy together with loans to get through this. Any step down for critical business needs to operate strict social distancing and health protection. So my approach to the economic response has three key objectives. Firstly, to mitigate the immediate impact by first and foremost protecting lives, also providing income protection for workers and households and maintaining critical national infrastructure and services. Secondly, to limit the medium-term impact on the economy by supporting businesses to maintain productive capacity and enabling diversification to respond to our most pressing needs. And thirdly, not to lose sight of the longer term, ensuring Scotland emerges, as we will from our current challenges, as a well-being, inclusive and net zero economy. So on the first area, on mitigating the immediate economic impact, our immediate priority and focus is to save lives, protect jobs, business and maintain incomes. So I welcome the additional UK government measures announced on Friday to support business and provide income protection for workers and households, including the Job Retention Scheme, which will pay up to 80% of wages. It provides some reassurance to those anxious about the months ahead. The UK budget also provided a stimulus package for most affected businesses via rates relief and statutory pay cover, followed up by a further £20 billion of additional spending and support. In Scotland, we committed to all consequentials going to business as part of the comprehensive economic response, including a £2.2 billion package of measures to support business and a £350 million fund to support welfare and well-being for the most vulnerable. I wrote to the UK Chancellor this weekend pressing for the extension and increase of the statutory sick pay to provide a more effective safety net and assurances for the 330,000 self-employed workers in Scotland. The removal of the minimum income floor is welcome, but the goal has to be a more comprehensive job retention scheme that encompasses the self-employed. On the second point of mitigating the medium-term impact, I'm also taking action to mitigate the medium-term impact. We will work to support otherwise viable businesses to protect their productive capacity through this crisis. We will maintain our critical economic infrastructure to secure delivery of key services and industries like health, energy, transport and food distribution. We've clarified our guidance regarding critical childcare, and as the First Minister has made clear, we close schools for a health reason. We must keep the number of children taking up childcare spaces to an absolute minimum. Employers have a responsibility to prioritise their work, change shift patterns, support working from home and drop non-essential work. This is about saving lives. Any work has to comply with social distancing requirements. We'll be working closely with the private, the public and the third sectors to help local authorities in some of their decisions regarding key workers for childcare as we proceed. Some businesses will have to hibernate now to reopen later, and we will support and encourage some limited businesses to repurpose activity productively, particularly in the healthcare, to help supplies in that area if they are still in need of operation and working. I'm in regular contact and communication with business organisations and the STUC. I met with the STUC and affiliated unions last week, and I have a telephone conference with them this afternoon where I will look to agree a fair work approach to deal with the current crisis with them. All businesses have access to our COVID-19 helplines, and there is website support as well. Later today, I will chair an emergency meeting of the Banking and Economy Forum. I also have weekly quadrilaterals with the UK and devolved ministers. The First Minister also chaired a weekly economy ministers group on Friday. One of our key aspects has to unclog supply chain blockages. We need to address some of the critical supply chain blockages, and that's essential that are essential to keep our economy moving. So with local authorities, these are the things that we've done already. We have removed restrictions on delivery times for retail, helping them to keep shelves stocked. We are changing the law to temporarily relax the single-use carrier bag charge for home food delivery. We've taken steps to ensure we pay our suppliers as promptly as possible, and this should be passed on to supply chains. Keeping money in the system, making sure people have money in their pockets, making sure that there is cash in the system is part of our immediate response. And we encourage everybody who can pay their bills to pay their bills promptly, and that's what the Scottish Government and public sector organisations certainly will be doing. So we then have to look at a line of sight to the future economy. At this moment in time, it's hard to think beyond the immediate crisis, but Scotland will recover, and I will retain focus on ensuring our economy and business emerge fit to meet the grand challenges of the post-COVID era. So thank you for the opportunity to update you. I will give as many answers as I can. Please bear with me. Some of these issues are developing rapidly, and anything that I can't answer immediately, I will make sure the committee does have answers to, and I will update the committee as regularly as we can.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. Can I start by actually asking a question that was put to me by actually several companies this week who are involved in various forms of construction, electricians, joinery, etc. And it was this. They heard the First Minister say quite clearly that she advised all construction industry to stop. But many of them have contacted me and said they are working often alone if they're rewiring a house or something, often in an empty building. Does this therefore include them? And the concern that is being raised by many of the businesses is that although the job retention scheme may pay 80% of wages if the staff are asked to stop working, there is no cover directly other than perhaps taking a loan for all the on-costs like vehicle leasing, buildings, etc. And actually taking loans will just kick the can down the road and probably put that business in difficulty in the future. Can you just clarify, can they keep working if they're working alone or in good social distancing within the site? And can they reinterpret what they thought they heard the First Minister say?
The First Minister was quite clear that work on construction sites should end. It doesn't mean that all construction work will end. There will be construction workers who are critical to, as I said, the critical infrastructure needs of the country, and therefore maintenance work that is required to ensure the country is running properly and efficiently in relation to key infrastructure. They will be required, but the First Minister was quite clear yesterday about construction sites closing. It's not just about social distancing when people are working on site, it's how people are travelling together. So this morning, with vans, with 5 or 6 construction workers sitting together, travelling to a construction site, does not look like social distancing to me, and is not social distancing. They put their own health at risk. Not only that, when they go home, they put their family's health at risk. So this has to be seen primarily through a health protection provision, and that is why the Scottish Government has set out its position as relayed by the First Minister yesterday.
So, for clarification, if somebody is travelling alone to a site and working at a safe social distance, can they keep operating?
It would depend whether that work was part of the work for critical maintenance of the key critical infrastructure of the company, of the country. That's the test that we have to take. And in terms, your second point was in relation to the incomes of the incomes of businesses and also of individuals. The 80% wage subsidy provided by the UK government is welcome, but it won't come in, as we've heard, until the end of April. That's the UK government's current timetable. It will be operated through the HMRC. That is precisely why the loans that have been provided that went live yesterday are part of this overall solution. And I think we should look at this, looking at the overall solution to make sure that every part of the economy can be addressed. And that's why I made the point particularly about self-employed, because that's a critical area that needs addressed, not least for some of the lone workers that you're talking about and sole traders that you've just mentioned. And that's why it's imperative that there is a scheme as part of the job retention scheme, and certainly to, making sure that every part of the economy and all workers can be addressed in some shape or form. But you'll be under no illusion. This is a health crisis. And if it's a health crisis, it's incumbent on all employers, whether it's in the construction industry or indeed other businesses, to be looking at themselves today to say, am I doing something that is putting my family, my neighbours, my elderly relatives and friends in jeopardy by sending people to work that shouldn't be at work?
Okay, and sorry to push you on this, but I think it is important because there are a lot of people out there that are affected by it. So if somebody is in effect leaving their home in their vehicle, driving to their destination where they see nobody because they're working in an empty building, they complete their work and they drive home alone in the vehicle back to their house, you're saying they still can't go and complete their job?
We've made it quite clear that this is a public health crisis. That means everybody has to be part of this, including the sole worker you've talked about. But in relation to making sure that we comply, we've already seen, even in the last period, where companies have been told quite clearly that people should work from home where it's possible. Some companies, as of yesterday, were not doing that. So, I think if you start doing this by exception, this by exception for individual cases, then I think you undermine the overall public health requirement of the country. And we have to see this through a public health requirement. The job of the economy and the job of me as Economy Secretary is to make sure that we have measures to support people through this difficult time, which is about people social distancing, staying at home. The announcement last night by the First Minister and the Prime Minister could not have been starker. So let's not look at this by exception. Let's make sure by the rule everybody is complying by the public health requirements unless it's for key critical infrastructure needs for the running of the country.
Yeah, I hear what you're saying, Cabinet Secretary, and obviously nobody wants to put anybody's health at risk, but clearly there is some confusion here, because if you are complying with all the public health risks and you're not having any contact with somebody, with anybody in fact, but what you're in effect saying is most people can't work from home if you're in any kind of practical job. Home working is only really available for those who are in some sort of service IT type industry. most people who are doing any, most other jobs, whether it's in retail, whether it's in construction, etc., can't work from home. So is the message that you're giving quite clearly that only IT workers or people in some sort of service industry that can operate from home can continue working, everybody else has to stop?
I think we've been clear enough in terms of people not travelling unnecessarily. Travel actually is one of the main issues here in terms of communicating the disease and
on public transport.
There. So can we just kind of ensure that we're focusing here on the public health needs and requirements? It is why there is a comprehensive package being developed. It's not finalised yet because we need to do more precisely for the reasons you're talking about, that self-employed person, that lone trader, etc. So the provision, for example, of grant support to help small businesses, that will go live today. That means that small businesses can apply for grants to get them through this difficult period. That means that if you are self-employed and you have a property that is considered as part of the system, you also will get that grant if you apply for that grant. So there's that system. There's the system of 80% wage subsidy for those companies that are particularly going into hibernation. That's why we need that. But we need to make sure that there is a safety net for everybody. This will be a temporary period, but it is essential that we get people to stay home, because staying home is the way you stay safe.
Right. Okay, I'll move on. We'll maybe come back to it. Willie Coffey. Wait.
Thank you very much, Convener. Good morning, Cabinet Secretary. I think, like other members, I've been pretty much inundated with email inquiries from a number of constituents about this issue, about whether people should or shouldn't go to work, and hearing some pretty disturbing stories that certain businesses and industries are remaining open during this period of time. Can you help us clarify where the designation of key worker and key business, key industry criticality is defined? Is it the UK government that's defining that, or are we able to further define and refine that in Scotland to try to help not only our business and industry but our staff as well?
Okay, there's a number of issues within that. In terms of critical sectors, the UK government has set out a provision of areas, which covers a number of areas in terms of what is critical to the infrastructure and the running of the country. This will be supplemented by the Scottish Government as well, and we will make sure and communicate that as soon as we have that available to the committee. But I'll give you one example. So on the UK Government's list of what is critical, they include finance, right? But that's not everybody in finance by any means. However, as I've just explained, in helping ensure the country can keep running, these small businesses need to be able to apply for loans. And so therefore there needs to be some provision of finance working to ensure people can get loans to pay the wages of their staff, and until some of them can perhaps get the wage subsidy that kicks in at the end of April. So therefore it doesn't necessarily mean that people need to be working in offices to deliver that. I was speaking to a senior executive of one of the major banks who in the space of a very short period of time has moved 3,000 of their 4,000 telephony services into home working. So people can be sitting at home carrying out that function. So that's a good example where it's not everybody in one sector, but clearly areas around health, etc., is the critical one. And that's why, particularly looking at the issue around key workers, the key workers we need just now is the nurse in the ICU, is the doctor in A&E, is the people who are looking after our elderly in terms of social care. That is the key workers. And that is why local authorities and they have moved mountains in a very short period of time to set up hubs to help support and provide childcare support for key workers. So John Swinney set out the categories within that. It's for businesses themselves, particularly those that are critical to the critical running of the infrastructure of the country, to identify what the key workers are and which of the key workers they have themselves. I, as a parent, as many other parents, will have received the form for key workers childcare. Earlier this week, my son is doing his studies from home. He's capable and able of doing that. But for those, for people who are key workers in our health areas, they need to have that support. And that's why when people filled in the form, there was 3 categories, and that's why the healthcare workers were prioritised immediately. Second to that, they had emergency services in other areas, and then third from that, some of the areas that might be critical in terms of infrastructure. So can I just say there are areas that are key workers for the childcare requirements, and I'm sorry I'm going at length, but this might be helpful. And then there's key workers also that will be identified for some of the testing that we know is required, and I know that the Health Secretary will be making a statement later, because one of the things that people are really, really concerned about is that if they have to stay at home following the public health guidance, but they are a key worker, particularly in a health environment, they want to be able to get back to work if they can. And so therefore, the identification of key workers for testing is another area, and that's certainly something that you'll hear more from the Health Secretary as well. Sorry that's at length, but that's, I think, important information.
It's very helpful, Cabinet Secretary, but there's some stories this morning that I'm hearing from my own constituency where builders and merchants yards are still open and distributing materials to customers and so on, and real engineering workshops are asking their staff to come in. I mean, this surely can't go on. Where are the powers to intervene to say, look, it's closed?
Well, clearly there's emergency legislation, and indeed this afternoon, I think there's the LCM provision from the Scottish Government. We need to obviously scrutinise this, but it needs to be there at pace to allow certain powers. There are powers, for example, let's take the example of pubs, where clearly there was non-compliance. I can just say, the other thing to say is the vast majority of businesses, pubs, restaurants, and also companies are absolutely doing the right thing. But the problem we've got, it only takes a small minority not to do this to cause the contagion that we know that will overwhelm the health service. So in terms of people's compliance, they need to do it because it's the right thing to do. Ferguson Shipyard closed, right? That was as soon as we heard that information, that's what we've done in terms of a company that's obviously owned by the Scottish Government. But that's what other businesses have to do, and they have to do it at speed. And I also would say this is difficult times for people, but we will come through this. But if people are closing and companies are closing, do speak to your staff remotely. Try, my life is becoming a telephone conference call just now. But people are going to have to be responsible in how they communicate by email, etc. But your staff will help you through this and to the other side. They will have ideas as well as to how they can get through this to get to the other side. But this is a critical time. Anybody listening to the Chief Medical Officer or the National Clinical Director will know this is the key time in making sure we flatten that curve to make sure that we don't overwhelm the health service. And that's why people have to take individual responsibilities. It's not somebody else's problem, it's your problem. And that's why for builders' yards, etc., please don't be operating in a way that brings you into any close contact. That's not social distancing. And actually, I know that people will have a lot of time and they'll want to do work around their house, etc. We are going to be a country of wonderful gardens, I'm sure, at the end of all this. But please don't be selfish in how you're approaching this for individuals wanting services, but also I think employers have to look after themselves. By looking after their workforce, they're looking after their own family and they're looking after their own neighbours.
Thank you. I'm keen to come back later on, but I know colleagues are keen to come in.
Just a quick clarification there. There will need to be some clear instructions to people like builders' yards, timber yards, etc., because a joiner contacted me today and said they've provisionally been asked if they can build dividers within the hospital should it be required. Well, if they're all closed down and the supply yards are closed down, they won't be able to get the materials. So there will need to be some clarity around not just shutting them all down, otherwise your critical infrastructure will also not be supported.
Yeah, exactly. And that's why I said to you that if you're looking at construction, for example, and you can take other areas, if they're doing building in hospitals to make sure that the critical health needs of the country is being dealt with, that therefore means that service will be required. But that's quite specific. That's something that is about the public health aspect.
Yeah, but that requires the supply chains to be available when they need them. So
yeah, so that's where but that's to do, and that's why I think there's something around. I talked about repurposing. The repurposing that we need for certain areas is about supporting the health needs in particular, and that's what some businesses will be required to do. But let's take a common sense point of view. That's actually part of that is planning how they would do that, in terms of the contracts that they have with the hospitals to make sure that at every step of the way that is done in a way that complies with social distancing. But it can't be blanket for everybody. And I think the danger people think is if it's a blanket permission for everybody to stay open, everybody will. And we're certainly far, far from that. And as of last night, if anybody did not get the message they should, we really are in a public health crisis and everybody has to step up to the mark.
Okay, thank you. Can I go to Jackie Bailey, please?
Can I maybe start about, you know, the clarity of government advice, I think is there for those who choose to read it. I'm keen to test out enforcement with you, because in my area there were 1 or 2 pubs opened, there were hotels having weddings, I mean entirely inappropriate behaviour if you were practising social distancing, never mind going into a position where we are advising certain businesses to close. So how is the government going to enforce things? And the example I would give you is today, the topical one, Sports Direct, insisting that all their employees go into their stores. I mean, quite how Sports Direct is of, you know, essential to the critical national infrastructure is beyond me. How can we enforce this to ensure that they don't open?
I think the public will take a very poor view of people who are deliberately compromising the public health now. I think the reputations of a number of companies who are forcing their workforce to come in will be, you know, irreversibly damaged. So therefore, they need themselves to think about the consequences of that. As far as enforcement is concerned, the emergency powers will help support that. That's why it's very important that those powers go through and at speed with proper scrutiny. However, we've seen the situation of pubs and restaurants, the police, who actually at a time of a public health crisis have better things to do as part of the planning and their support, particularly of health services and others, had to resort to emergency provisions on licensing. Now, licensing, because it's the sale of alcohol, it's easier to enforce in terms of closure, but that's what they had to do. I think it really is not, I think, the proper use of their time and efforts to do that, but they had to do that. But I also, and I say this, I suppose, trying to understand where people are. People have had to shift their behaviours rapidly over a very short period of times, and that has required a lot of mental adjustment for people to realise what social distancing actually means and what it doesn't mean. And therefore, we have to understand that the country at speed is having to completely change its way of operating, whether it's socially, personally, but also in terms of business and companies. So, you know, on the one hand, I've got great admirations for those companies that have, you know, taken it seriously. Great admiration for the companies that have taken it seriously, had their business continuity plans, thought through what they would do, and then executed it very, very quickly following advice. But there are some exceptions, and unfortunately, it's not just themselves that are affecting. The exceptions affect everybody else. But it is a critical issue, and it's how do you take people with you? This is obviously going to be for a considerable amount of time. I can't tell you how long, but a considerable amount of time. And I think the way that it's been approached in Scotland has been to try and be open and transparent with people, to take people with us so that, you know, everybody can work together on this. Because if you feel you're part of a national mission to do this, then I think everyone will go that extra mile. There's fantastic work been happening with businesses and indeed communities, making sure they can support their streets, their towns, their communities, and to make sure that there's resilience in place and that's fantastic. But that means everybody has to step up to the plate. But that's a difficulty in enforcement, because I'm not going to pretend that all those powers are there. Some are there and are being used judiciously. I think there will be a statement at some point from the Justice Secretary as well, and some of these points might be able to be put to him.
Okay, thank you. The Cabinet Secretary mentioned alcohol, which allows me to neatly ask about whisky bottling plants. Obviously, whisky is a key part of our food and drink industry, but the bottling plants actually employ a huge number of people that will work quite closely together, and I don't think there is necessarily PPE available for them. What's your advice, what's the government's advice in those situations?
In terms of whisky bottling, I have a major plant in my own constituency. I know the importance to the economy, but there will be companies that will have to either certainly step down or go into hibernation and therefore use the provision and support that's available for them. I also would like to commend those distilleries who have been completely innovative and creative and putting at the disposal of the health service their distilleries to make sanitisers, etc. That's a creative response to what's there. And they are the companies that people will remember. It will be the distilleries that are doing the right thing and helping the public health need by making sanitisers that will be supported in the future, not those companies that are making their workforce go to work unnecessarily. But if they are operating, even making sanitisers or in any way that's required for the health infrastructure areas. It's really important that PPE is provided where they can, in terms of analysing the situation where they're in. So health and safety and protection is paramount, and that's part of what I'll be producing with the SCUC, is what we expect from people in terms of health and safety of the workforce, if those workforce are working in an operation.
Okay, so if they're simply, just to understand this properly, if they're simply bottling whiskey and there's no PPE, you wouldn't recommend that they continue?
Well, in terms of this, I don't think anybody should be travelling to work just now. These are the sort of companies that actually shouldn't necessarily be working in the first place. But the issue is, can they go into hibernation in a way that can come forward? The loans that were established and by the Chancellor are extensive for companies. Now, some companies, and I suspect the whisky industry, the alcohol industry and bottlers might be in a better place in terms of the loan provision than others, but that loan provision takes people through from now until the end of April. From the end of April, that's when the 80% wage subsidy will kick in.
Okay. Could I ask one other question, and then I'll let other members in, and this is about key workers. Could I get your confirmation that you regard pharmacy and food retail as category 2 of the key worker definition? And the reason I'm asking that is you'll appreciate that both pharmacy and food retail are critical to the country's response, and we need to keep people in medication and also fed. And we've seen some of the kind of very strange behaviours with people bulk buying, which we wouldn't want to encourage. But for a number of these people, actually being able to go to work is dependent on childcare. A lot of them are women. So there has been some confusion, some inconsistency of approach, and I'm wondering whether you could give a clear signal as to how you would regard both pharmacy and food retail workers. Are they part of the critical national infrastructure and therefore category 2 key workers?
In terms of the categories, clearly category 1 is for the immediate health workers and social care workers. In terms of pharmacy, undoubtedly has to be considered key work. And can I just put on record, I'm sure everybody acknowledges, everybody's quite aware of the gearing up of the health service for this, but the immediate pressures on pharmacies has been very, very acute, and the pharmacists and indeed everybody that are working in pharmacy are under a tremendous amount of pressure, and have done a fantastic piece of work. So they are obviously part of that system. And obviously in terms of food retail, in terms of making sure supply chains are going, that's something that, again, in terms of critical, who is absolutely critical. There's also quite a bit of shift working. There's a bit of a sensible approach here, and also remembering, there are people who will be working in food retail who also have themselves may need to go into self-isolation. They also may have underlying health issues, etc. So what you're also seeing within that sector is and those workers need to be supported financially, and I think the retailers have, in fact the Scottish Retail Consortium have been extremely good in terms of engaging rapidly with the Scottish Government and ensuring that we understand their needs and vice versa, and supporting them. The recruitment that's going on there will also hope provide some some support in that area. So there will be some instances, and it might actually also be geographical, which is why local authorities will know what they're, and this has to be led by public health, right? So therefore there'll be a limited number of spaces in different local authorities. So what they will know from, again, the forms that everybody received, I didn't fill one in, but others, particularly in these categories, will have filled these in. They will identify how supply and demand is working in relation to that, and that also allows them, as they go through the categories, to make sure that they're making the most for those categories. But that also means that in terms of critical food supply, people will have to identify what is critical or otherwise. But I'm happy for the Education Secretary to give you more up-to-date information on key workers, because it's not my distinct area of responsibility. I'm looking at how we keep the country running, etc. But I do know that obviously from the key workers' point of view, people will want to know what's happening. I think we will have a better idea as of yesterday as to how that supply and demand is working in terms of provision, but it will be different in different areas. If you live as my constituency is semi-rural, so we're having pick-up points and people having to travel to other areas. That brings up with its own issues. But certainly those that are not absolutely critical and key should also be looking at their shift working patterns to see if they can help support people with childcare.
Yeah. Can I just push the Cabinet Secretary a little bit more on this, because she's absolutely right. Her function is to keep the country running. Both the Scottish Retail Consortium that she referenced and USDOR regard these workers as key in keeping the country running. I understand her explanation of perhaps the kind of differences across the country, but what I'm trying to get is clarity that the Scottish Government regard these workers as Category 2 workers, because they are part of supporting our critical national infrastructure.
I'm trying to look in my briefing for where the actual different definitions in the list is. I haven't got it just to hand, but supply of food is, right? But it's not every single worker in the food supply and retail area that will be defined as that. So therefore, that's why it's up to, so it's not everybody. It's a bit like the finance question earlier on. It's actually not going to be everybody, and not everybody needs it, because if you're sensible in terms of your planning and your working, you will allow those that have got childcare responsibilities to have that, or to work on a shift area. So part of that is to make sure that within that sector, it's those that absolutely need to have the childcare will get the childcare.
Yeah. I suppose the difficulty is it's very clear in the UK list of key workers, and it's a bit more fudged in the Scottish list. I understand what you're saying, but I think that lack of clarity is leading to people being excluded on the ground that would fit with your kind of, definition of what would count. So I think clarity on the part of the Scottish Government would be enormously helpful for implementation on the ground.
Yeah, I agree, and we'll make sure we can provide that to you from the appropriate Cabinet Secretary. But the critical thing is public health. So if you have very broad categories, and the UK's are very broad, they will not mean that everybody within those broad categories will get childcare, and people might be interpreting, because everybody wants to interpret that they are part of the categories and they will get that support. But we have to make sure that we limit the number that are using and if we don't limit it, then the actual public health issue is compromised.
Sure, and I'll finish on this, convener, but there are reports of local authorities sending, not key workers, but sending teachers and childcare workers away because there are insufficient children that they're having to care for. So there is clearly a gap between what the perceived demand is and what the actual demand is. And as a consequence, we're excluding people that perhaps shouldn't be excluded.
And I think that's a very important point. That's why there'll be some rebalancing will take place. And they will need to take place because actually you want to make sure that you've got enough cover for those that need it, but also you're not compromising the public health in the numbers. And that's why I said this is Tuesday, Monday, yesterday, only Monday, and this, remember, the schools only closed last week. They've moved at pace and scale to make sure that there's provision for people. So I think they've done an extremely good job to get us to where we are, but there will be some rebalancing will probably have to take place once people realise what the supply and demand is, requirements for it.
Okay. Andy Whiteman.
Convener, and thank you, Cabinet Secretary and your officials for all you're doing in these difficult times. I've got quite a few questions on the economy, but I'm reluctant to extend this discussion, but I think it's important. I mean, there's a text gone out just a minute ago. I've just received it, and I think that's via all mobile phone providers in the UK to every single person who's got a mobile phone, with the key UK government message. And it takes you through to a document, which I looked at, was published last night, in fact, in relationship to the advice and the instructions issued yesterday. And on the staying at home policy, it says you should only leave the house for one of 4 reasons, one of which is travelling to and from work, but only where this absolutely cannot be done from home. Now, that's not the advice of the First Minister. The First Minister's advice yesterday, instruction, I should say, was to travel to essential work if that work cannot be done at home. The UK's advice that's just gone out to millions and millions of people is you can travel to work, but only where it absolutely cannot be done from home. So there is a lot. You'll be aware of this. I think people need clear guidance on what is essential work for the purposes of the public health emergency. The key workers debate has obviously been ongoing for 72 hours or so and is underway and is subject to clarification and all the rest of it. But this particular one, there is confusion.
So, in terms of what we need to do, the First Minister has set out what the Scottish Government's position is and needs to be for public health reasons. And can I say that we have have and are working with the UK government as closely and collaboratively as we can, and have been for many, many weeks in relation to the public health crisis in Cobra, etc. In terms of the response that we've made, you know, when we say things, we mean them, and we're quite deliberate, as is the UK. There will be some times when perhaps that might be slightly different, but we will get there in a very quick order, I expect. So therefore, you know, we are trying to replicate and be in step as much as possible with the UK.
But the messages are different. The message is different.
So
I
I haven't seen your text. I haven't seen the wording that they've issued. But I'm quite clear that the public health, and this is driven by public health, which is a devolved matter, remember, the public health advice that we got was from the First Minister and the Chief Medical Officer yesterday. And I think people understand the importance of that. The issue, I think you're right, is that the key workers actually has been more about healthcare workers and childcare, and as Jackie Bailey said, other areas as well. There will be, and it is an issue about what is essential, and that's why I made the remarks about what is critical business or not. A lot of people have interpreted critical business as what's critical for their company to, you know, keep going, etc. And we understand that, but that's why hibernation, etc. is a better place to be. But your point about what is essential business and what is essential that still needs to carry on.
My understanding from the First Minister's statement yesterday is that guidance would be published very soon.
Yes.
And that's what I've been telling people.
Yes.
I've also been telling people to follow the First Minister's advice, not the UK government advice.
So there is information, I think I said earlier on, there is information from the UK government, which you're referring to. The Scottish government will also provide supplementary advice to that. And that will,
but it is different. It is different. I mean, this advice was published last night by the UK government. Travel to and from work, but only where absolutely cannot be done from home. In other words, it doesn't matter what the work is. It could be bottling plants. It could be electricians, it doesn't matter what it is, anything that can't be done from home, you can travel to work. The First Minister said only travel to essential work, and this morning you've talked about critical. So it's just, I mean, this is a very fast-moving situation.
Yes,
I think the public need very, very clear advice, and it will adapt as the days go on.
Yeah.
I'm just really making the point. I don't want to take up a lot of time.
Everything is moving very, very fast. That's why I'm trying to recognise that, you know, the announcements only a week ago on a number of areas on social distancing, the announcement only a few days ago about schools closing, etc. Things are moving rapidly and at pace, and for a reason, for a public health reason. So, but people want immediate clarity about what they should do or not do. We're trying, and it's a day by day. In fact, yesterday the First Minister gave two statements, not just one, two statements. And that was following Cobra, obviously, yesterday afternoon, where we're working, obviously, with the UK government, and the First Minister is part of that process. So therefore, the information that the UK government has given out will be supplemented by information from the Scottish government. I don't have that to hand to you this morning, but we will be issuing that. But we're recognising and understanding what is essential services is quite a strict. It will be a strict interpretation of what is essential.
Thanks. How are discussions going with the UK government in relation to self-employed workers? Are you anticipating anything imminently?
So this is something I have been raising. I raised it with Alex Sharma when I spoke to him, and also with the first quadrilateral we had with other economy ministers. There is dialogue. They understand that this has to be. There has to be something developed. There has been that practical dialogue with the UK government. We know that they are working on this, but it's not for me to announce what it will be, and I don't know what it will be. But they have been impressed how important it is. There are 330,000 self-employed people we estimate in Scotland. They need to have a system in place, and so we are impressing on them the importance of that. That's why, again, I wrote at the weekend. But perhaps I might invite Gary Gillespie, our Chief Economist, to comment on the scope and scale of what we might need to consider in terms of self-employed, with the permission, Convener.
Gillespie.
Okay, thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary and Convener. So the issue of self-employed in some senses is more difficult. As the Cabinet Secretary said, we estimate around 330 people have reported, 330,000 have reported as self-employed. Of those, only a subset will actually pay their own income tax and national insurance and have a direct contractual relationship with HMRC. So if you were thinking about a similar scheme to what's been enacted by the Chancellor around paying 80% of wages through PAYE, it becomes more difficult in the self-employed sector because of the 330,000, approximately 230,000 people do self-assessments in Scotland. So there'll be some self-employed people that earn below the national income threshold. It means they don't pay income tax, and there'll be others out with that system. So that it's a more complex package, and that's why we've seen changes to the benefit system being put in place also, and a mechanism to consider how you do that. It's also more complicated as well if you think about the different roles and types of self-employment. There can be tourism, seasonal self-employed, so taking averages or snapshots of people's income at a particular time is more difficult. But I think what essentially is needed, if we step back from what's going on at the moment, this is essentially a health crisis, and that health crisis is induced an economic slowdown, both in response to and in order to meet the requirements to beat this, to meet the requirements to deal with this issue. Now, this is different from any other normal slowdown, and it's important to look at it in that context. A positive outcome is, in a sense, if we can reduce the curve, as the Cabinet Secretary said, in terms of the public health crisis, and in doing so, we know that the economic activity will slow across the economy. The key issue for us is really the support for those businesses, workers, families and income through this period, and maintaining that productive capacity so that when restrictions are eased again, we have people in a place that they can return to employment. So you will no doubt see estimates of falls in the gross domestic product, which is typically the value of goods and services produced, and people will say, oh, previous recessions we had X, this one is double that. This is different. This is a public health crisis. We're deliberately and having to force compliance with public health guidance, which means we have to restrict activity which is non-essential, as the Cabinet Secretary said. The key thing is protecting those people through this so that when the economy comes out of this, we can pick up more immediately.
So on that point, if you don't mind, that also looks as if there's 2/3 of self-employed would be able to have a relationship, that could have a scheme that's driven through HMRC and PAYE, etc. But the ones that aren't, shouldn't, in my view, should not be left to rely on the benefit system. Although some people may start to have to use universal credit, they've never thought they would need to use it, and we understand the timescales have changed from that, from 5-6 weeks to on day one in terms of application. So there is something around looking at the package of people who might be able to have there's council tax deferrals, there's mortgage holidays from banks. In some instances, the grant system will be able to help self-employed if they work from a premises. So what things? So we're not just leaving this to the UK government. We ourselves are scoping and working with Kate Ford, scoping all the areas around self-employment. What does that look like? What are the schemes that might have to be put in place? Ideally, and I think the best way forward would be to do it through a similar system to the job retention scheme, and certainly for the bulk of self-employed, that would be a way forward. But if not, we have to make sure that there are other ways of ensuring that they are supported. But we need to look at it across the package of things that can get people through a period, and that's where, particularly around the banks, and that's why I'm speaking to the Banking Economy Forum, there are people that currently are self-employed freelancers probably have no relationship with the banks in terms of their business and what they do, but they may need to for the short term. And that's why I know from the banking side of things, and they absolutely have responsibilities, and they know that, that talking to your bank now is the key aspect, which goes back to my point about home working people. When you're speaking to somebody in your bank, you maybe end up speaking to somebody who's working from home, has perhaps a couple of toddlers in the background, but they're trying to do the right thing for the country by doing that. But hopefully, Andy, that gives you a kind of an update of where things are, and we hope to hear sooner rather than later, but I can't give you timescales for the UK government, and be them obviously to announce any scheme.
Okay, and in terms of the job retention scheme, this is the employers have to apply to be part of this.
Yes.
I mean, what's your message to employers who, some of whom I know, do not intend to be part of this, would rather lay their workforce off?
I would say to those employers, we need to get through this and recover. You need to have the productive capacity. You need to have the relationship with your staff. They are the ones that will get you through this on the other side. For those that had already taken, I thought, early decisions, reconsider, because there is that wage subsidy support. Obviously, in terms of somebody mentioned earlier on, there'll still be outgoings in terms of fixed costs. We also need to be looking about what can be done to reduce some of the fixed costs that businesses have, so that they can stay almost in a stasis and hibernation, but be able to recover. Those loans are low cost and also interest-free loans. Business interruption loans are quite considerable for a number of companies. So if they want to be part of the recovery, and if they want to have staff who want to work for them, and to ensure that they have a business to come back to after this period, then they should be part of the overall scheme. And I think seeing it as an overall economic scheme that helps hibernate or step down those companies that are still involved in essential services, by ensuring that we all together act as a national economic mission to support the public health mission, then we can make sure that when we come out of this, we've got the staff and also the capability and the companies to have a more rapid recovery than we otherwise would have. So I would say to them, be part of this system, be part of the scheme, and be part of that national mission.
Okay, on non-domestic rates, the reliefs are being automatically applied, is that correct?
Yes.
From the 1st of April?
Yes,
Yep.
we understand obviously some people will have not long ago had letters, but in terms of the release, they will be automatically applied. But on the basis of the grants, people will have to apply for the grants. And I can tell you, and Kate Forbes may comment on this later on today, but those systems will go live today.
Okay, and just given the nature of administering something like this, it's not possible, presumably, to be more discriminatory. For example, I mean, Coylon Bridge Hotel, who laid off their staff and made them homeless, will get £290,000 relief, but we just have to give it to everyone.
Well, why people ask why are we using reliefs and also grants based on non-domestic rates? It's speed. It's speed and simplicity, because that's people wanted to have confidence that there was a scheme in place that could be operated and delivered. So that is the reason we've done it on that basis. There are some differences that we have made, but perhaps I could ask Ian Story, with your permission, convener, to maybe comment on the variations that we have. There are certain things that we know we don't want to give funding to, but again, it's categories as opposed to anything else.
So an example you give, you're absolutely correct. We would anticipate that they would qualify for the relief, but ministers have taken a decision on some of the grants to, unlike in England, where they're essentially universal to anybody that qualifies for the small business bonus scheme. Ministers have taken decisions to exempt a number of properties on the basis that this is a property tax, not a business tax. And there are large numbers of properties that you wouldn't typically consider to be small businesses. And in England, they might qualify for a grant, but in Scotland, ministers will be applying exemptions. Some examples could perhaps include things like billboards and ATMs and bare ground and parking spaces, where ministers have taken a judgment that they are not impacted by COVID, they're inanimate objects that happen to be non-domestic properties. They will not be eligible for the grants. So unlike England, where they'll be applying automatically to all SBRR, small business rates relief eligible properties, we'll be applying some discretion and making it application based to try and better target the reliefs on those businesses that need it.
Okay, so apart from those exemptions, it'll be the grants will be available for those in receipt rather than eligible for small business. So you have to have applied for it and be receiving it in the first instance. And then you've got some categories you're taking. And
with a few exceptions where on disabled relief and nursery relief, where a number of properties may have been eligible for SPBS but have chosen to opt into a different relief, they will also be eligible. So where they're otherwise eligible for SPBS, they will be entitled to the grant.
Okay. Can I just ask you about short-term lets? I mean, I've been doing a survey of commercial short-term lets in this city. We have 382 identified to date of commercial short-term lets, only one of which is planning consent. In other words, they're operating illegally. But many of them are on the valuation rule and are in receipt of small business bonus scheme.
So ministers have taken the decision to exclude self-catering to try and get at the short-term lets. The short-term lets themselves are not a specified category on the non-domestic rates system. So self-catering and timeshare units and similar products are properties that will currently be exempt from application for the grant.
Okay,
We've given council some discretion where in all of these categories, these are not universally applied definitions. So the councils will have some discretion where they wish to take into account the local circumstances and apply the grant, but those classifications are currently exempt from eligibility.
Okay, can I ask as well for Scotland's range of business support agencies, Scottish Enterprise, business gateways that local authorities run? I mean, how are they coping in terms of the demands that are being placed on them for, in the first instance, advice, general advice on what is available and what can we do and what should we do?
Okay. So in terms of them, they are very resilient. They will also be working from home, as all good employers will be ensuring that their staff that can work from home will be working from home. They are clearly reassessing their forward programme in terms of realistically some of the projects that they might have been supporting other companies will no longer be in the position to go forward at the timescale they said. So they are reassessing that, and they will make a statement about that fairly soon if they've not already done so, into how they're planning their future work to make sure they reposition themselves to what the immediate need is. Also, convener, perhaps to give you information, as part of our economic response from the Economy Secretary's meeting with the First Minister, I've identified a number of key areas and tasks which different ministers will be taking forward. Clearly the one that in relation to business support pace, Jamie Hepburn is involved in that, and I spoke to him yesterday about that. I spoke to Paul Wheelhouse about the oil and gas industry. I spoke to Kevin Stewart in relation to construction. So, you know, systematically we're looking at different areas, in particular to make sure that we can work through all the issues that we can for different sectors. In relation to the helpline was only launched, dare I say, a week past Friday. It's a long time since a week past Friday. Obviously, a lot of information has now been able to be made available online, including the information particularly around the business reliefs and the grants, which I think went online Wednesday or Thursday last week, I think it was. So online information has really helped in terms of the pressure on the helpline. So I reported to Parliament last week in response to a question from Paulette McNeill that at the beginning of last week, some of the rates of calls had gone up to almost 2,500 on a daily basis. Since the publication of information online, they've gone down to about 400. So people understand. Now, that doesn't mean as of the announcement last night by the First Minister and Prime Minister, we won't have more businesses again wanting to get assistance and help, and I would expect to see that to creep up as well. We increased the capacity. They worked with Visit Scotland, who obviously have got obviously a completely different place, because we don't want people to travel to come to Scotland at this time. We will in the future, and they'll be very welcome when we do. But obviously they had some capacity as well in terms of support for call centres and online support. So there's been a lot of creative work to make sure that the pressure points have been dealt with. But I do expect Scottish Enterprise to have an announcement in terms of their activity fairly soon.
Okay, thanks. I'll leave it just now.
Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much again, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, can I just go back to the self-employed issue there we were talking about a moment ago with Andy Whiteman? I've had a number of inquiries from constituents still not clear about it. Is it the case that the provisions for self-employed are not defined yet by UK legislation? Are we waiting for that to be put in place at the moment?
The answer to that is, I suppose, partial on the basis, as of now, I think the UK would be expecting self-employed to look to the benefit system and universal credit, mortgage holidays, etc., which I don't think is sustainable in terms of the level it's at. So therefore, what I can say is I know that UK government are working on a scheme just now. I just don't know the details of that, but I have said to the Chancellor as well in my letter at the weekend, even if they haven't got the details of this ready as yet, they need to communicate that there will be a scheme, because that will give, I think, a lot of people comfort at a very disquieting time.
Are we pushing for it to be along the same lines as the 80%, based on information with the HMRC?
There are different.
Trying to get that.
Yeah, there are different solutions. The resolution institute has come forward with different views. Remember, the other countries have already done this. Other countries, Ireland and Denmark and other countries, have already established the wage subsidy and also have a self-employed scheme as part of that. Some countries, for example, Germany and Norway. Well, Germany certainly has a wage subsidy scheme, but not necessarily one in self-employed. They will perhaps have already had existing schemes that kick in, etc. Different countries obviously have different schemes. So therefore, as part of the overall package, it makes sense to make sure it's not just about employed, there's a self-employed scheme. Where it's possible to use the same similar areas to HMRC, PAYE systems that are being used in terms of existing relationships. And it is part of that, you know, it's almost like a reverse system. You know, for many years, companies and individuals have paid taxes into the HMRC, you know, on the basis they have their details. Can they get a system where they're just paying out instead of, you know, self-employed paying in? So, to me, that would be, you know, would be a scheme that, again, if we take the criteria, it's got to be simple and it's got to be quick, using existing processes rather than inventing new ones. Will mean that a scheme will be able to be delivered sooner rather than later. But there may still be the issue of a delay, and that is why the loans are there in place, which came into operation as of yesterday, to help people tied to that areas. And even if people have not had a relationship previously with the banks, they will need to, even for that short time until they can receive the subsidy, whether it's self-employed scheme or whether it's on the employed scheme.
Mm-hmm. And you talked about measures that perhaps the Scottish Government could deploy for the moment in anticipation of this being agreed. Could you just expand a little bit more about what powers we have there, what help can we offer?
Well, we need to. There's no point in replicating something that can be done somewhere else. You know, we've got devolved competencies currently. The UK have got reserved competencies over the tax system. So if they've got the responsibilities on that and they can do things through the tax system, they should do that. We should do the things that we can deliver on. And that is why the hugely important announcement by Aileen Campbell last week, you know, in terms of £350 million in terms of welfare support. And, you know, people are going to have to get support. They've never asked for support previously. But we also know that the best way to get that to the people who really, really need it is to use the third sector, charities, etc., that are operating in individual communities to make sure that's there. You know, if people have emergency crisis situation, that's what the Scottish Welfare Fund can help with, but it's not something for the long term in any means, and certainly not for the volumes of people that we're talking about. That's why we need a scheme in place that will help with people's salaries.
And do you expect further clarity this week on most, if not all, of these issues?
I would hope so, but I do not speak for the UK government, and I can't say at what point. But they know that they need to work at pace with this, and if they can't give all the details, they at least should give a signal that there will be a scheme, and I think that's something that should happen this week.
Okay, thank you.
Jackie Bailey, please.
Thank you. I wonder whether I could move you, Cabinet Secretary, on to the question of implementation, because whilst I recognise that things may be happening at pace, for a business on the ground, they hear an announcement and then they don't know what to do. So I wonder whether you would set out, both in terms of the grants and the job retention scheme, what's available, from who and when, so that there is absolute clarity for all of us as indeed for all of our constituents, whether they are in employment, whether they are businesses.
Okay, so if we start with what the Scottish Government is responsible for, there are a series of support measures which are available. We have the rates relief, which, as we've said previously, will be automatic to those that have been designated that, and people can get information of that from the mygov.scot website and also the Fine Business Support website from Scottish Enterprise. There will also be grants that are available, and the applications for those grants will be available now, and that's £10,000 for small businesses. And I might ask if you want to provide any more detail. Sorry? Available from noon today, those grants. Noon today. So, okay.
That's good.
So that's live and current for you. In terms of other support for businesses, if you look at the banking support, the banking loan support that have been guaranteed by the UK government, that came into operation yesterday in terms of loan support, and people should be looking at for loan support. There's also been mortgage. 3-month mortgage support in terms of a mortgage holiday has also been supported, and also people can ensure they get council tax deferrals as well. So this is trying to limit people's incomes. Sure. From the UK government's point of view, for companies and for employees that are working for companies, those companies can take out loans, again backed by the government now, to tide them over until such times as the job retention scheme and the wage subsidy is in place. The UK government have said the job retention and wage subsidy scheme will be in place by the end of April. That will be operated through HMRC, and importantly will be backdated to the 1st of March. So that means that those companies that are thinking or have laid off workers should make sure they're part of that scheme. They will get the wage subsidy backdated to the 1st of March, but they may need, depending on their own liquidity in their own business, to take out a loan to cover them until the end of April, until such time as that backdated wage subsidy will there. In the meantime, good employers will be continuing to pay their staff.
Okay. Is there one portal that people can access all this information or the links?
The Scottish Enterprise portal, which is the Find Business Support portal, is the one that has comprehensive information that brings together what is provided by the Scottish Government, but also the UK Government, and links into their sources of information as well. But it has to be that complete package. We need a complete economic package to help respond to what is the public health crisis. And we will be working assiduously. This is our focus now, is to work assiduously to try and make sure that we have as comprehensive package as possible. And that's what we're encouraging the UK to do as well, so that people know where they stand, can stand together to get through this and still have jobs and still have businesses as we come out of this.
Okay, thank you. I thought that was very helpful.
Jackie,
can I?
Sorry, I think Ian was going to supplement. Sorry.
Can I just say, in terms of the rights package, what we sought to do when we updated the mygov.scot website was email all MSPs through Mr Day's office. We would anticipate doing the same today. We would also anticipate in our typical non-domestic rate stakeholder groups, we have a Scottish Ratepayer Forum, which has representatives from the hospitality sector, the retail sector, the self-catering sector, it's essentially the large national bodies representing ratepayers. We would typically communicate all of this directly through those networks as well. So we'll be proactively seeking to target large groups of employers through proactive communication, in addition to the consolidation of all the advice on the same website. And we would anticipate that all councils will also link to our website, so that there's a consistency of message. In the past, where councils have updated information, this is moving so rapidly that councils can quickly get out of date. So on the NDR measures, we're likely to use our website as the hub and invite councils to link to us.
Yeah. I suppose my perspective is, if I'm a small business in my constituency, who do I turn to for the information? And I would prefer, one port of call that then links me to everything else. So, yeah. Can I move us on to Fair Work? Because I understand what you're saying about this, the need to have speed to get these grants out. But I am concerned that some of the people receiving grants, not just the example given by Andy Whiteman earlier, but a number of other employers are not engaging in good fair work practices. So, for example, I can think of universities like Stirling University, where some of their casualised workforce will be paid off. I can think of other employers where they've insisted that their staff take unpaid leave rather than sick leave, or get paid for following government advice to self-isolate. And I am aware that some are just penalised in all sorts of other different ways. So whilst I accept that you may not be making the support for business conditional on Fair Work, I am wondering whether you have power at the end of the day to take back some of this assistance if they aren't observing Fair Work principles. I mean, if they take the grant and sack all their staff, are we really giving them that money?
So in terms of Fair Work principles, it's something that I've taken very seriously, and the government over a number of years has, and that's why the discussions with the STUC and affiliated unions is very important. And that is why later today I expect to agree a strong statement of what we expect from businesses and organisations in terms of health and safety, but also about paying workers when they're sick or self-isolating, supporting those with caring responsibilities, facilitating homework, etc. In terms of clawback, etc., in an ideal world, I absolutely would strongly believe that those that are not adhering to such measures, if they have been receiving public support through this period, should be, I suppose, penalised in some shape or form. I just don't know practically whether that is at all possible. I think what is possible is to make sure we're clear about what we expect from businesses. But the most important thing is to get the funds to the businesses so they can pay their staff, and that's what we're doing. And if we had made it conditional, I think it would end up in a bureaucracy that would delay payment and would mean that people would not have money in their pockets. So therefore, we'll be quite clear about what our expectations are of companies and organisations. But I'm sure, Jackie, with your creativity and ingenuity, if you come up with a measure to do this, we will. Ian's looking at me very wide. He's not sure what we can do at this point. But you know, we are going to be in a different landscape when we come through this.
Absolutely.
We are absolutely in a different landscape when we come through this. So those organisations that abide by the public health rules, that support their staff through this, that abide by and support fair work principles, are the ones that are going to be in the best place to recover, and importantly will be the ones that will be in the best way to recover with support from the public purse at that time. So therefore I think there's something around seeing things in the longer term as well. But I'm not going to pretend we have schemes for giving penalties, etc. at this point in time. We're trying at this stage to have a national mission that everybody understands that in Scotland we have values that matter. We have values about fairness and respect for our workers, and we know that if for people to get through this issue, public health crisis, and to come out of it the other way in a strong way, their staff, their ideas, their ingenuity, and your respect for them is what will mean that you get through this and recover well.
I agree with the Cabinet Secretary about the need to have values and principles, particularly just now. Unfortunately, not all employers have heeded that message, and the treatment of their staff, frankly, is appalling. I wonder whether she will keep a list of those employers that have followed the government advice and values and principles, and those that patently have not. And I will take up her challenge of considering whether there is something at the end of this that rewards good behaviour, as opposed to not. But I just think somebody somewhere needs to be monitoring this, because we can insist people do things, we can urge them to do it, but actually the reality is they're not doing it now.
Yes, indeed, and that's what we will do, and we will support and celebrate and encourage those companies that are doing the right things and making sure that they are showing, those that are showing leadership for this country in the economic response to the health crisis are recognised for that, and those that aren't, well, that will be a story, as she said, for another day, but I think people will remember.
Good. Could I ask two very specific questions? The 200,000 people told to self-isolate for 12 weeks with critical conditions, so cystic fibrosis being one. Many of them work. Is there advice to employers that actually they can cease to work on full pay for that 12-week period?
Okay. That is a very specific point in relation to those with very compromised health systems that have to obviously take special measures on that. I can't give you an immediate answer about what we're doing with their employers. We probably wouldn't necessarily know who their employers were, but that's something I will take away and see if we can action to give comfort to those and support to those that are obviously going to be in the most extreme isolation.
Okay, and this is another specific question that I'm happy if you wanted to take away. A hotel in my constituency has gone into hibernation. They will take advantage of the job retention scheme, but of course they need to put their staff into furlough in order to do that, to get the 80% support. But actually they would need access to some of those staff some of the time. So for example, if they're doing, accounts, admin, property upkeep, so whilst the staff would be in furlough, they would need small amounts of their time. Is there flexibility in the scheme to allow that?
Well, we don't have the scheme yet because the UK are developing it, and it will be available for payment from the end of April, but will be backdated to the 1st of March. But that specific point you raised was, again, one of the issues that I raised with my officials just yesterday, because there is a kind of point about it's almost like a step-down facility, and making sure that in the step-down facility, even however minority, and again with social distancing, people operate that they shouldn't be penalised, that they can't be part of that wider scheme. So there's common sense says that the scheme should extend to that, but I'm not sure how it will practically work. So it's an issue that I will raise with the UK government as well. But I think it's a very important point, and a number of companies are going to be in that position as well as they hibernate.
Okay, I'll stop for now, convener.
Okay, Andy Whiteman.
It's just, I mean, this is a fast-moving situation, so I appreciate the stress that everybody's under, but, I mean, the website that I instinctively always go to is gov, whatever it is, gov.scot/coronavirus, the thing on the front page, and yet that's actually got quite limited information. It tells us the rate of infection from tests and deaths and a couple of links. In my view, and I'm just putting this in a constructive sense, that page should contain the key links to Scottish Enterprise, to COSLA, you know, whatever, because it is spread out and people are looking for information much faster now.
Yeah.
They want it quicker than they would ever do before. So is there some work being done to try and make that all rather more seamless?
Well, we're constantly developing and improving communications in whatever shape and form. But the speed of this is so rapid. You know, what has been a public health emergency when we were looking at perhaps reduced capacity of 20% has now in the economy has now gone to a situation where, you know, it's such a major change even in the last week, and we understand that. Actually, one of the important things in terms of updates is dates, and so that's why I'm sure everybody's looking at the dates of which something is current, because it will change on a regular basis. But I think your point is well made, and I will ask the Scottish Government Comms people to look at, you know, making sure that the portal, which everybody's looking at, has the links elsewhere. These links are being established between each other's websites, whether it's COSLA Social Welfare Fund, but also looking at, as I said, to the Fine Business Support one, which is I think has got a really good and simple way to identify what your needs are and where you go. But I think it's a very important point you make, and I'll definitely take away that and make sure that improvements can be made. But please bear with it, you know, everything is moving at pace. No, we
absolutely get that. And just for the record, once again, I mean, is the government going to publish a list, and it will change, it will adapt, of that work that it considers essential in relationship to the instructions that were issued by the UK and Scottish governments last night? Yes, we will provide a supplementary advice and guidance to that. That'd be extremely by the UK government. I've said helpful. That. Yeah. Because there are, for example, I've got constituents who are going into work because they need to shut down labs, for example, safely. And it's clear that they need to go into work, and they may need to be into work for 2 or 3 days to safely shut down various chemical processes, etc. But I've also got constituents who are going to, who are being told to go to work that is utterly non-essential. Right, I think you've said it. Yep, great. I mean, have we got any sense of what the impact of COVID-19 is on the Scottish economy just now? I mean, where are the real problem areas that you're identifying will need perhaps particular assistance when we come out of this, as opposed to now? In other words, might not be safely hibernated, may no longer have a market, whose workforce may have decided to go elsewhere. It's probably too early for that, but presumably we do need to start thinking about that. We could ask Gary Gillespie, Chief Economist. Yeah.
So as I said earlier, we need to think about this differently in the context. So in a normal business cycle type recession, you would typically be impacted by a range of factors. You would see particular impacts hitting different parts of the economy. What we are seeing now is a totally different order of magnitude, of speed, and essentially to meet with the health crisis and that extent. So in one sense, the typical measures we'd use to look at the economy don't really matter in at this particular time. So businesses closing down to adhere with health guidance is good, it's positive, and the key criteria for us in thinking about the recovery when things pick back up is how many of those businesses are able to come back to where they were and come back very quickly. And on your question about sectors, we've obviously seen the immediate impact of this through those sectors most closely associated with personal contact, whether it's hotels, catering, tourism. But actually what we've seen is that it's spreading more widely. And in that context, the policy responses, how you view it, you have to think differently. And as the Cabinet Secretary said, it's a comprehensive package of support that's required to enable businesses to get into the right outcome for this period. For some businesses, that will be to safely hibernate, to protect their workers, their capacity, so that they can reopen. For other businesses, there may be an opportunity to repurpose some of their activity and support the health crisis. For some parts of the economy, as we've mentioned, some sectors, there's actually demand is greater, and there's supply issues around medical provision, supplies, pharmacy, so there's potential for those to expand. So in thinking about the recovery, this isn't like a normal downturn where you would worry about losing productive capacity through either competition or not responding sufficiently. This is really, really about protecting workers, businesses, and in support of the public health crisis, so that when we come back out, and there may be positives that come out of this in the context of how we work, how many people need to travel, more remote working, how we link to the environment in terms of some of our climate policies, our green policies, and essentially also valuing what was previously maybe different types of employment, lower paid employment, which we're seeing some critical functions include things around provision of goods, supplies. So there's a different element to thinking about the economy. So and obviously this is part of a wider global epidemic as well. And essentially that means that we are dealing with this both within Scotland and the UK, but we're being impacted by demand and supplies elsewhere. So the best thing we can do in a sense is not worry about the output or capacity that's having to close at the moment, but think about businesses. The advice I've given to business people that I know is think about how you can close your business or keep your business so that you're viable to open up as quickly as you can again. This isn't a normal response to a downturn where you think about shedding staff or premises. Think about putting yourself in a safe position, the welfare of your workers, so that you can come out of this and respond and function for the economy. So it's really that messaging is really important. We have a strong, robust, resilient economy. We have international sectors that are doing well, and essentially we will return to that. That's the key point. And what we don't want to do is lose capacity because of businesses thinking their critical function is around themselves. It needs a comprehensive package that allows businesses to reach the right outcome for them, their workers and sectors, so that they can come back. So we may see, for instance, when the data catches up with this, monthly or three. So, for instance, we estimate if the economy was operating at 80% over 3 months, GDP would fall by 5%. Now, in the last financial crisis, it fell by 6% in Scotland, but over a number of quarters. So the pace of this is so quick. But what we shouldn't worry about is that fall, because that fall will happen and those numbers will be larger. But actually, it's the bounce back. It's so if GDP, for instance, falls by 20%, but comes back up by 20% when we come out of this, that's the key indicators. So we're keeping productive capacity and businesses.
Okay, and can I ask you a question about the financial services? I think you mentioned there's what's the group that's meeting on that?
So this afternoon I'll be co-chairing the Banking and Economy Forum.
Right.
We've reinstated that. That was in place as part of the Brexit preparations, but obviously clearly as one of the areas that we need to work with, we'll be speaking to them. So obviously in terms of making sure they're supporting people in the short term, but also with a view as to how they help support exactly what Guy Gillespie was talking about, the recovery side of it as well. They are not the only sector that we're having these discussions with. There are regular stakeholder forums in different sectors being led by different ministers to capture lifetime information as to people's experiences, but also to plot through what will be the best ways forward. And some of that, yes, we understand will be the schemes that are financial, but some of it is not. So what are we doing to help make sure we can help support people through the hibernation phase, but also in the recovery phase as well?
And will you be discussing the question of insurance? Because there's been a lot of questions and debate about who is covered for what.
Yeah.
And obviously, everyone has their own cover and it's in the documents and you interpret those documents.
Yeah.
But there is quite a bit of concern around legal liabilities.
Yeah. That's
not just in terms of insurance, but in terms of contractual liabilities that have been entered into by businesses. I mean, for example, in the construction sector. Is it safe to assume that some of those contractual liabilities and some of those legal liabilities will be addressed in the devolved emergency bill to try and provide, I don't know, some kind of...
So a lot of the insurance issues are actually reserved, as you know.
Yep.
This is a key area, not just, I suppose, for companies that are claiming on their existing insurances. And we know not all businesses will be insured in relation to coronavirus, etc. But there are also public liability issues, as she's quite aware of, as to how do we keep essential services going. Some of that will be in the construction industry area, and that's an issue that in my discussions yesterday, my telephone conference with Kevin Stewart, he's leading on the construction areas, so he's looking at those issues that are particularly around insurance as well. But there's also some of the kind of public liability issues, for example, for childminders, you know, in terms of providing support for key workers, what they're covered for, what they're not covered for. So these are systematically, all these issues we will work through, but also in terms of just your request for the Banking and Economy Forum that's meeting this afternoon. To me, insurance is becoming one of the key issues to help things move on, but also what's going to happen in the future as well. So I will certainly make sure that insurance is raised, and with your agreement, Convener, I'll also say it's an issue that the Economy Committee of the Parliament is very interested in as well. I can't give you all the answers on what will happen in this, but increasingly it's becoming one of those areas that we just have to systematically work in, and it will be sector by sector, I suspect, in some of the issues around public liability.
And in terms of contractual liabilities, which is the law of contract, which is all devolved, to cover people who may be facing claims that are being made unscrupulously for failure to deliver, failure to fulfil, will the emergency bill that, as I understand, the Scottish Government will be bringing forward in the next week or two, will that be able to amend the law of contract so that some of those existing conditions cannot be enforced in light of the emergency?
We are aware of the issue quite clearly, but in terms of the solution to that, I can't give you information just now, but that's an area I'm quite happy to come back to the committee on.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Right, before I go to Willie Coffey, I just want to ask a couple of questions that have been raised. The first one is around food banks, although not strictly businesses. They are doing obviously a power of work out there, and I've had quite a number contact me to say, do they count under the sort of supply of foods? Can they continue to operate and as long as they comply with the public health rules around social distancing, hygiene, etc.?
In terms of food supply, clearly food banks, unfortunately, have been critical for some time in Scotland, and obviously are critical now. They are part of the resilience, community resilience response that we're working with local authorities and others. So in terms of support, in terms of the criticality, I would say that they would be. But obviously the point about social distancing, etc., as you say, yeah, and also absolutely. Health and health protection, etc. And that's where they'll need support and guidance from those that are working and continuing to work in supporting of the community resilience in areas and local authorities. But that's an area that, again, my colleague Aileen Campbell has got more oversight on. Okay, thank you.
And the other one, which is a slightly interesting one, I've had several people who are moving house and have their move dates within the next sort of 2-3 weeks. And they want to know what is the position around removal companies operating.
Okay, so in terms of that, I can't really give you, blow by blow, sector by sector, issue by issue, but we're absolutely aware that these are critical areas. That's something that I understand the UK government is looking at in relation to the financial situation that more that people are in relation to if they've purchased a house but not quite concluded it during what is a hiatus period. But clearly, in terms of removal, I can't give you an immediate answer for what's happening with that, but clearly, people are facing that as we speak. But obviously, that is an area that has to be addressed both financially and in terms of what is reasonable health and safety. But there is a kind of there's a strong message about stay home and stay put. but you know, in your situation, if you're in the middle of moving in the next you know, weeks or months, that obviously is a major issue. But I can't, as of now, give you a clear direction as to what people should do in that situation.
Right. I think that probably highlights a lot of the difficulty that people are feeling, because maybe in weeks and months we may have answers to that, but for some people this is this week or next week, and they are feeling that they're getting quite mixed messages about whether the people can be going to work to deliver the service that they are now requiring. I want to therefore just take us to something which is, I suppose, underpinning a lot of this, and as the Economy and Fair Work Committee, I think is something we just ought to spend a minute exploring. And as somebody who comes from a health background, as an ex-nurse and health manager, I absolutely understand the health element of it and the public health element of it. But I want to ask you what work you've done or how you've looked at it in terms of the balance between health and the economy, because there is clearly a distinct relationship that if the economy starts to go down rapidly, that will have an impact in the long term on health, not in terms of COVID-19, but in terms of the broader health of the population, because what we can't afford to do is lose our economy. We must, as you've alluded to, and several times during this meeting, we must protect it for the longer term. And the public health messages have been very clear around hygiene, around social distancing, around not engaging in social contact. But I think it's something that has been raised numerous times by people, is the confusion that if they are complying with those public health requirements, therefore why can they not operate? And I think that for employers and employees, it's not just a question of employers asking their employees to come in, it is also a question of employees wanting to carry out their work if they can do it safely, not only from an economic point of view, but also from a health point of view in terms of you know, continuing productive activity. So I just wondered, what kind of conversations have you had around that relationship between economy and health, and how are those decisions being arrived at in the broader picture?
Okay, as you might appreciate, the Scottish Government's resilience mechanism has been operating for many, many weeks now in terms of preparing for what we expected, but also on a regular basis and at ministerial level and for a considerable time as to what the consequences might be in different areas and how we might prepare for that. Clearly, we are guided by the science and we are guided by experts in relation to the public health response. This is a public health crisis, and in terms of resolving this, we have to take the advice that we are given and when we are given it. But clearly in the last, dare I say, 10 days, that has moved extremely rapidly from a situation where probably only 10 days ago we were looking at a situation of how do we make sure that employers support people when they are self-isolating to recover from COVID-19 with a view that they then return to work, and how we made sure that there were fair work principles in relation to that, to a situation that has moved even in the last the last 24 hours to even more severe restrictions around people's movement. So we've moved through the stages of social distancing and then closure of pubs, restaurants, etc., to a situation as of last night where there's real restrictions on movement of peoples, and for good reason. In terms of aligning the economic response, the economy response has been to help support the public health response. So that is why the requirement for a wage subsidy that would allow companies to hibernate or indeed step down was one that was prepared by the UK government. We were encouraging them to do that because we felt, looking at other countries and what was needed here, that was required. It's also why on Friday I was part of the First Minister and the Chief Medical Officer's daily press conference to again impress the position about companies' responsibilities with the workers to ensure if they could work from home, they did work from home. But things are moving at pace and rapidly, and they're moving at pace and rapidly because the health experts are telling us if we don't do this now, if we don't have people staying home, then it does put lives at risk. And that's a very hard measure for people who have travelled that distance and over recent days and over the last 10 days in particular, to realise that their life has changed and changed completely. And it's not just changed in their family and social life, it's changed in their economic life as well. But in relation to making sure that we've got a strong and productive economy coming out of this, we've been working and will continue to work. That's what all the focus of our government is. How do we help the public health crisis? How do we help people in their communities? And how do we make sure that we support those that are operating in our health service as best as possible? And that's why we want to make sure that we've got a resilience that we can come out of this. And that's why we're very keen for companies, if they can go into hibernation, to go into hibernation. Everybody else, there's no competitive advantage. There's no competitive advantage in staying in place. If everybody's hibernating and you're hibernating, and then we come back out of this in terms of recovery, that's going to be the best way to get a sharp and swifter recovery than otherwise. So this is all part of a one-system approach. I can't be at Cabinet this morning because Cabinet, obviously it's at the same time as this committee. It's important that I'm accountable to you and to Parliament and to the public, and I think it's important a means by which we can get some of the key messages across. But you know, as we speak earlier on this morning in Cabinet, the focus is entirely on COVID in terms of how we can respond to it, both in the immediate term, but also to have assurance that we're working sector by sector with our colleagues across the economy areas. And that is why yesterday I had 11 telephone conference calls with all my ministerial colleagues and indeed others to make sure, as part of that economic resilience, we're doing our bit to make sure we get through this and we're well placed for a recovery.
Yeah, I think that's why the concerns are raised about having consistent messages, because there definitely is some consistencies in the system in terms of what people are hearing. The UK government are making it very clear that if you can work from home, you should. If you can't work from home, you should make sure that there are public health measures in place, such as social distancing, etc. But only this morning they're saying, I think the Minister Janik has said that, for example, in construction you can go to work as long as those provisions are in place. So I think we do need some clarity around that, whether it is a public health requirement or whether it is just a decision by the government that they would rather everything was shut down, because I think they are two different things. If you can work safely in an environment, can you? Or are you just being asked to shut down regardless? And I think those are the kind of clarifications that businesses now really need, because many businesses who will be asked to shut down, in effect, in that case, will not come out of it because they won't have the resources to do so, and their markets may disappear in the interim period. So these are very, very big decisions for a lot, particularly of SMEs, because it may be the difference between survival or not surviving. And for many employees, it's a big one, because even with the compensation scheme, a 20% loss on their wages, if the company can't afford to top it up, will make a big difference. And in some cases, some of the people that have contacted me have said one of the partners has already got no income coming in. If the other one then loses another 20% of theirs, they are in difficulties themselves. So these are really important day-to-day questions now for people. However much everybody wants to be part of the long-term success of this, there are real individual problems now running, and for many people they will lose their jobs and lose their salaries. So I think this clarification is extremely important, because people need to know why they're making the sacrifices and whether those sacrifices were actually necessary in terms of what we're facing. So I'll maybe leave you to put that in a sum up somewhere, but I'll move to Willie Coffey now. Mm-hmm.
Thanks very much again, Convener. Cabinet Secretary, I just wanted to return to the issue that Andy Whiteman was raising there about banking and insurance and so on, but to add into it people in debt repayment situations. You know, clearly people are going to be faced with being unable to pay or service debts that they face, and whether there's been any thought or provision to relax or otherwise those arrangements, and be grateful for any kind of assurance that you could give people on that.
Yes, that's a critical area, and indeed that is one of the areas in terms of relaxation of some of the debt issues that you know, people have with banks. In terms of there have already been steps taken by a number of banks to do this already. One of the things I'll be impressing on the Banking and Economy Forum this afternoon is to make sure they're going back to the point of a single portal, perhaps with Scottish Financial Enterprise, where banks can set out exactly what they're doing to help people in terms of delaying or deferring, whether, well, we know that there's a mortgage holiday provision, but obviously for businesses, opportunities to delay existing loans and to ensure that they can take advantage of the loans that are being supported by the UK government currently. So that's an important area. There's also an important development on bankruptcy to make sure that there's deferrals and it won't be moved for bankruptcies, and that was announced by Jamie Hepburn just at the weekend. So there's a whole series of different measures there. One of the things, because everything's moving at pace, this is happening on a day-by-day basis, we'll obviously want to try and ensure that not just yourself as the committee, but MSPs generally have got information as to what's been a new development, what's already happened and what is a new development. But your point about supporting people so that they're not having to default on loans and be penalised as a result is absolutely critical in this time. If we're going to get people through and we're asking them not to conduct their business, they need to be supported, and that's why banks are part of the responsibility of this in terms of the national mission to make sure that businesses survive and to get through this.
I'm thinking too about some of the more specific debt management agencies that are in operation, that are effectively large call centres that interact with public to retrieve and recoup and recover our debts and so on, and whether this consideration that you've discussed there will extend to that sector too.
What's the word? I didn't.
Debt management agencies who just pursue debt and the repayment of debt from people. It's not directly from banks, it's debt management companies. Debt management, people that
I think that's a critical area, because people are. This is, you're almost like asking everybody to stay still, stay put, and actually for the system almost to be frozen in terms of that debt recovery, whether it's in in terms of mortgages, whether it's in terms of anywhere else. In terms of the governance of some of these companies, that this will be in the UK reserved area, but it's one of the areas that I will raise as part of the quadrilateral, because I think it's an important one, because it might be easier to get better answers from the banking, insurance and economy sectors than it might be from some of these debt recovery companies that you're talking about. So I think that's a very important area to raise, and it's something that will probably require UK-wide response in terms of restrictions of what can happen.
Okay, thank you.
Can I maybe take us slightly away from coronavirus, but not entirely? The oil and gas sector, I think the Cabinet Secretary mentioned earlier, and she'll know that the price of a barrel of oil dipped as low as $30 a barrel. That's probably the lowest price in 30 years. This is the second big shock for the industry in the last 5 years. She'll be aware of the huge impact it has, not just on the northeast of Scotland, but through supply chains and jobs throughout Scotland. What measures are in place to help the industry beyond the package that's in place for coronavirus?
There have been packages in place, as you know, in terms of the recovery of the oil and gas industry following the problems from a few years back. This is a key focus for Paul Wheelhouse, the Minister who's for Energy, who has been in regular contact with the oil and gas industry as to what they need. There is also the operation of the oil and gas UK business group that has been looking at the responses during this period, because some of it is in terms of critical infrastructure, in terms of support, and that's where clearly one of the big issues there is also health and safety and protections, and that's again something that is being pursued there, but also in terms of reconvening the group that was in place during the last problems that the oil and gas industry had. It's being reconstituted, and Paul will help lead that to identify what can be done in terms of reductions. Clearly, there are immediate issues, but I think, as Jackie Bailey's alluding to, this also will mean, what does this mean going forward as well?
Yeah. Okay, thank you for that. And I do want to turn to the wider issue of what happens in the long term. I mean, I wonder what assessment the Scottish Government has done as to the likely percentage shrinkage in the economy, because if we know what we're anticipating, then we can plan better for what kind of stimulus we think needs to be in place. So I suppose the question is, how bad do you think it will get in terms of shrinkage of the economy? What stimulus are you planning to try and lift us out of that? And because it is self-evident that there will be lower tax receipts and higher welfare spending, and that has huge implications not just on the economy but on the budget. So I am trying to look to the long term and how quickly and what plans you have in place to help us get through this.
So in my opening remarks, I set out 3 different areas. The
Yep.
third one was making sure that we had sight on what that recovery might look like, and we want it to be one that is a well-being and net zero economy, and to make sure that some of the direction that we're moving on, we can resume that. And actually, you know, there will be changes in people's behaviour. That means that in some areas we might be able to try and tackle that more easily. I suspect active travel, for example, or indeed public transport travel when it's resumed. People might have more familiarity with that in terms of limiting the amount of movements, people working from home more. That's one of the areas that we were looking at previously anyway. But in terms of, I'll bring the Chief Economist in as well, if that's okay with you, Convener. But in terms of stimulus, I think we need to look at what type of economy we want to be, and how do we make sure that when people are coming out of hibernation, that if there is public resource available, which I sincerely hope there will be. Budget discussions were part of Cabinet's discussions today. Unfortunately, I wasn't there, so I couldn't make the case for this. I'm making it to you, so please support me when
We'll make it to them too.
when it comes through. But I do think we should be thinking in terms of some kind of green stimulus recovery coming through this. It's a sensible thing to do. It would align with our plans in terms of our climate change action plan activities, and in terms of future competitive advantage. I think Scotland could be well placed for that, to make sure that we're moving into that space. And that also means what can we do in terms of stimulus to encourage whether it's businesses or indeed homes, whether it's home construction. Again, conversations I've had in the last few weeks is when construction recovers, which it will, how do we make sure that as part of our stimulus for that sector, we can also be combining that in relation to some of the areas we can realise the shifts that we're going to have to take in terms of home, community, resilience, heating, etc. in a low carbon way. So it's maybe not the time to go into the detail of that, because we don't necessarily have the detail of that, but I just want to reassure the committee that that is also one of the streams of work that we have. How do we support businesses coming through this, but to be able to adjust in a way that the recovery we have is one that gives benefits as well. And I also just want to, I think it's probably worth reflecting, is the key people in our society just now are social care workers, nurses, doctors, people in the health service, retail workers, call centre workers who are handling all of this. And in terms of our recalibration of the country as it comes out, I hope in that kind of an understanding of what the economy looks like going forward, we also understand the society and what matters and what we value in our society, and make sure that when we rebuild our economy and when we recover, we do so in a way that reflects the type of society we want to be. And that's why I said it's got to be one where we put well-being at the heart, but also that we build a net zero economy. But I also want to bring Gary Lesby in, particularly around your reference about size of shrinkage and what that means, and perhaps it gives more impetus for us to look at measures that are not necessarily just GDP, and that's why I particularly focused on well-being, because I think we will start, not just in Scotland, not just in the UK, but across the world, I think re-evaluating what we want to value as part of a well-being economy.
Lesby.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll pick up the point about the loss of predictive capacity, or what do we think the loss is likely to be? And it also relates back, I suppose, to the convener's comments around the balance between health and economy. We've seen very much public health crisis and the planning being based on different stages, from delay to contain, research, mitigate, or whatever. And in a sense, what we've seen is as the curve on health moves up, the remedies, the public health remedies required, have had to tighten and escalate, and that conversely has the opposite impact on the economy. So there's almost, if you think you're flattening the upward health curve, we're looking at the downward economy curve, and in one sense, within that downward economy curve, so GDP will fall is falling at the moment as activity stopping. And so just to make the point about the kind of health analogy in a sense is, as the Cabinet Secretary said, the initial thinking around this was that 20% of the workforce would be impacted at the peak time of this health crisis. So that would be roughly in Scotland 600,000 workers in that kind of order of context. What we're seeing now is it's moved on much beyond that. So we're seeing a different scale of impact. So in thinking about it from the economic perspective, it's you've got to mirror what's happening on the health side, and the outcomes from an economic perspective is when this health crisis eases and things return back to normal, how much of our productive capacity, people, skills, workers, income are able to recover and come back immediately. Now, so that in a sense, so GDP doesn't really matter. What matters is that businesses that have stopped at that output that's foregone at this time, that the businesses and the people in capacity are kept together. So that's the criteria we would look at. So it's different from other other downturns. The other thing, as the Cabinet Secretary touched on, we're seeing quite innovative and different business practices being operated now, and companies are having to adjust to how to deal with this. And what we may see emerging new ways of working, new trends that actually improve productivity, change the balance of work-life balance and how people operate. So these restrictions at the moment are essentially forcing businesses to look at their operations and how they operate within the economy, and there may be benefits when we come out of that. In the context of the recovery, in one sense what we imagine, or we know, activity is slowing, output as traditionally measured is slowing, and essentially as this crisis abates, we should see the opposite of the restrictions being eased, activity coming back and output coming back onto the economy. Now, at that point, we will have an idea of any productive loss that we've had from the economy that's over and above what would have normally happened. And that's essentially what we're trying to mitigate at this time. In terms of the response at that time, the fiscal response or wider response, the Cabinet Secretary's already mentioned kind of green stimulus, but actually until we know really what the global economy is looking like and what the conditions are in terms of the broader outlook, then you wouldn't really design it now, but there will be options and interventions that you could look at. And the scale of the health crisis and the response by the UK government, which is very comprehensive in dealing with that, this is uncharted economic territory. The scale of the responses we've seen and the speed of those and the fact that they're coming wave after wave, exactly mirroring the escalation of the health crisis tells you how serious and significant this is. So we've got to kind of stand back from the normal data and say we've got to think clearly about our outcomes, our recovery, and for those it's about protecting people, incomes, households, self-employed businesses through this period, because as the Cabinet Secretary said, we aren't losing competitive advantage. Essentially this phenomenon we're seeing in Scotland, the UK, is happening in France, Italy, the US, China, Germany. So when we come back out of this, all of those economies will come back out. It may also challenge some of the global supply chains, the just-in-time type manufacturing systems, but we will respond, and I think it's important to convey it's a public health crisis, the economy mirrors that, and we have to think differently about that.
I absolutely accept that the stronger the public health response is, the greater the impact on the economy, and I think the public health response needs to override every other consideration, and the Cabinet Secretary has made that clear. But I am nevertheless interested in what we assess the scale of the impact not just on GDP, I accept the point about well-being, but GDP is the measure we have, so the scale of the impact, because when we come out of this, even in the short term or the medium term, because there are doubts as to whether this will be 12 weeks or 18 months, we need to be ready with a response, because it is easy to close down a business. It is much harder to set one up. And the levels of unemployment that we will see will be significantly higher now than there have been for a while. So I do think it is time now to have some interventions and some stimulus, because the continuing uncertainty will mean less investment and fewer exports. So I want reassured that we're not going to wait and survey the field, but actually we're going to have a package of measures available now that will help move forward, as well as waiting to see what else does happen, because I think there will be a huge impact on the economy, huge reduction in GDP, and that brings all sorts of questions about what the budget's going to look like going forward.
If it gives you...
I'm very conscious of time. Can I just check, are you able to stay for a bit longer?
That was my last question anyway.
I've got a couple of other bids for questions, and I'm just, it's 11:36.
I'm not quite sure when my call with the Banking Economy Forum is, but I don't think it's as early as this, so perhaps another 10 minutes should be okay.
Another 10 minutes, all right.
Can I address Jackie Bailey's point? So in terms of our response, we want to ensure that there's a comprehensive economic response. Some of those levers will be with the UK government, some of it will be with us. In terms of how we look at the business aspect, in terms of where people are, part of our discussion of economy secretaries was under the guidance of the advice from the chief economist, was looking at business structures and what we expect. There'll be some category 1 companies who either have closed or will close, some of which will have had maybe structural issues like Flybe, etc., even before this. The second group we were looking at is those that could operate on some limited lockdown, some kind of step down, kind of a step down basis. That was the second category. Obviously, in terms of public health, that may be more limited than we otherwise would have thought even a day or two ago. Thirdly, was the area around hibernation, and again, that was an emphasis to try and make sure we had wage subsidy to support that group. The second group is about realigning capacity or repositioning those companies that can actually reposition themselves for coming out of this. Some of them are repositioning currently. We've got manufacturing companies, for example, looking at medical supplies, ventilators, etc. And then they've got the fifth category, which are those that are expanding their services because of the need for this. I mean, retail is an obvious one in terms of supermarkets. So we're already looking at those areas and how we then support them coming through the other side, but also making sure that we, in support for these companies, we're getting them in a position that they can recover. What will be one that we have to, yes, keep a watching eye. It doesn't mean that we don't do anything sooner rather than later, but we anticipate what that might be coming through to make sure that we've got measures in place to help people when they come through that. But your important point is it's easier to restart something than start from scratch, and that's again in terms of the economic response is exactly what we're trying to do in making sure that people stay in hibernation but come through it. Use the wage subsidies, use loans in the meantime, and keep paying your staff.
Okay. I suppose my final thing, will there be a revision to the Scottish Government's budget?
And there will need to be.
Fine.
Yes,
Thank you.
it almost goes without saying, doesn't it? Andy Whiteman.
Secretary, I noted at the weekend that there was the Accountant in Bankruptcy has made some important reforms. I suppose the most substantive is suspending action on division and sale and eviction from property.
That's what I referred to earlier on, that there's already
indeed.
action been taken in relation to bankruptcies and making sure that people, there's no movement on that, and that's been frozen.
And the rest of those are basically administrative reforms, which are helpful in the current crisis. This committee has paid quite a lot of attention to debt solutions. There are a lot of people who will not be able to pay their bills. Is there any proposals to suspend any of the powers that creditors have to take action against debtors who are simply unable to pay their bills because of the health crisis?
So a number of points here is how do we make sure that people have got in their, enough money in their pockets to get by over this period, particularly for their essential services, which, in terms of daily outgoings will be food in order to keep themselves in that position. There's action by energy companies to make sure that they're not doing anything that's in detriment to people. And also that might be an area in terms of deferrals if necessary. But again, that has to be a conversation with the energy companies about what they do. And the point about creditors is well made. Again, in terms of my understanding, that will require UK changes in terms of legislation or regulations. But again, in terms of working through, and that's what we're all going to have to do, is working through all the different areas. How do we minimise the impact in this to give enough people enough resources to keep going through a difficult position, but also to try and mitigate their outgoings in whatever shape or form they are, whether it's rent, whether it's mortgage, whether it's council tax, whether it's in other areas. I can't give you instant responses to this, but it is also one of the areas on a shopping list, a very long shopping list of different things we have to work through. And this is probably where, in terms of my appeal to this committee as well, you're saying that you've worked a lot on debt as part of the committee's work. And obviously, dare I say, can I just say this is my first appearance in front of the committee in my new role. So I think we've had to hit the ground running in this case. But I do think that the solutions and ideas from this is also a national mission. And I really appeal to this committee, if you have suggestions, ideas, work together, work collectively, cooperatively, and if the things that you think could work or ideas, please be part of that solution, because we're not all going to get all the solutions of this immediately, and we will need to make sure we use the creativity of everybody, and that means absolutely everybody, in making sure that we address every different point. So please, that's my invitation to you, but I'm sure I didn't have to invite you. That's something you'd want to do yourselves as a committee anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you. Members, have you asked all the questions you want to ask? Yeah. In that case, can I just ask the Cabinet Secretary, is there anything else you want to add before we close?
Not at this stage. Just an appeal for patience. Things are happening at speed. People want instant answers. We will give answers as soon as we can. But I do think that if we can just appeal to everybody to work collectively together, it's going to be hard, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be very painful for many people, but it will be nothing as the pain that people will feel as a result of what will be a very severe public health impact of COVID-19 on individuals and their families.
Yeah, indeed, and I'm sure we'd all echo that. So can I thank the Cabinet Secretary, Fiona Hislop, for coming today, and also to Gary Gillespie and Ian Storey. I know it probably wasn't the easiest first appearance, but I'm sure as time goes on, you'll be back and we'll look forward to seeing some progression, some answers around all of this as it all moves forward. So thank you very much, and we'll pause for a minute while we change over.